What's up, guys? Welcome to AirCheck Your Life. This is the newly rebranded Learn from People Who Lived It. I'm Mathew Blades, and I'm going to bring him on the stage right now. That is Dr. Dave, our resident psychiatrist. And I'm going to be honest with everybody. I'm a little self-conscious jumping into this podcast. I just had to have some surprise dental work done today, and the right side of my face is a little bit numb. And so if you're wondering, like, is this guy having a stroke? No, I'm just, this side of my face isn't moving very well. And so I'm doing my best. Dave, I want to jump right into it today because, we've been spending the last 3 weeks on metacognition. I was actually in a flight from Nashville to Phoenix last night, and I was having a really interesting conversation with a guy, and I was telling him about our concept, and I sent them the link to our podcasts so that he could get into this and learn more about this. And so cool. We're going to jump into Quadrant 4 today, which is all about kind of putting it all together, awareness plus control. But the best thing we could do for our audience that just jumped in is to give like a 2-minute recap of quad 1, 2, and 3. You agree?
Yeah. So what we're talking about right now is the awareness control matrix, right? So this is how you develop metacognition and how you insert metacognition in between fast and slow thinking when thoughts pop up in your mind and you're about to make an automatic response, which is what we do. 90% of all of our decisions are automatic responses to situations. And the idea of metacognition is putting a little space in there so that you're not constantly automatically doing things. And the way that grows, and people find themselves naturally in one part or the other, but let me go through the different quadrants in the matrix just as a quick recap. So quadrant 1 is that you have low awareness and low control. So this is the no filter, whatever your impulse is, you kind of act on it. You don't really have much control over the outcome, and you're not really sure where it comes from. You just kind of do your thing.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
How do people know if they're in this quadrant?
Well, you're not going to know it in the moment because you have low awareness. But if you find yourself constantly having tensions and turmoils with people and things that are happening automatically or just taking you to places that you don't want to be, you might want to stop and take a look back and see what's going on. Why do I keep ending up in this situation and not getting the results that I'm hoping for?
Okay.
It's not random. It's not automatic. There's a process to it, and it's something that can be learned. So when you ask that question, you're now moving yourself into quadrant 2, where you have some degree of awareness, but the control isn't quite where it is. So you're aware that you're doing something. You're aware that a situation triggered you. You might still have an automatic response to it, but at least there's a little glimmer of some insight into what's going on. And usually from quadrant 2, people start moving into quadrant 4. So you develop awareness, you develop a measure of control. As you improve your control, you end up in quadrant 4. Then there's also quadrant 3, which we talked about last week, which is low awareness but high control. So these would be people that are highly regimented. They have strict rules that they follow, but there's a certain degree of rigidity that keeps them from asking questions about, why am I doing this way? I know I have all these rules about how things must be done, but sometimes that rigidity causes conflict in relationships and limits your choices in situations. And I think sometimes you have to step back and question the framework that's framing the rules that you have that you're following.
Can I ask you a question that just kind of came into my mind? And if this takes us too far off track, you can bring me back in.
Yep.
What I'm thinking about right now, and we talk about it all the time, and I talked about it on Saturday as I delivered the keynote that you were nice enough to come and be a part of. But the old programming, this is starting to become better, more and more language, right? Like taking a look at the way you were raised and how that might be impacting your decisions. where is the synergy between metacognition and that type of a practice where you're taking a look at the way you've been raised and the way that that's impacting you?
Yeah, metacognition is the hook that allows you to take a look back at some of that earlier programming. It's hard to do it in the moment, because usually emotions are running high, or there's some confrontation or something that creates an urgency that the best you can hope for in that situation is to have a little pause, a little space that you can explore some other options in the moment instead of just immediately going to your default state and acting without really thinking much about it. But in the after period, that's when metacognition um, that's where it's good to reflect back and say, well, why do I keep doing this? Okay. What happened earlier on in my childhood, or what situations did I experience where that now became the way that I handled the situation? Again, that doesn't necessarily give you the tools to fix it immediately, but at least if you start to develop an association, then you can start chipping away at it and trying to find some different ways to go at it.
Okay, cool. So today we're going to spend the bulk of our time here in quadrant 4, which you would define as awareness plus control.
Yep. So you have more awareness, you have more control. So what does that do for you? So what that means is metacognition is online, it's working. Your fast thinking is still running fine. You have those automatic responses to things. Slow thinking is available, so you can shift from fast thinking into slow thinking if you have that pause. But nothing is set in stone. There's no one default setting that defines the entire situation. So you have all of these options that are available now.
How do I know if and look, I think what the game I'm playing right now, as you're explaining this in my head, I'm like, where do I ultimately want to live? I think I want to live in quadrant 4.
Correct.
Right. And most of the time I want to live there. And so I'm not even sure the question that I want to ask you, but I guess that's what I wanted clarification. Like, I think our goal is to be in quad 4.
Right.
Okay.
So let me talk a little bit about what that means.
Yes.
What are the benefits of living in quad 4? So there are 6 areas that I want to touch on that really define like what improvement looks like, being in that space.
Okay.
So what you're developing is you're developing earlier detection. You start to catch activations before they peak. You start to have some insight into what's happening in your body. Maybe you feel a tightening in your chest, or you feel yourself jump, when you're triggered by something, or you start to feel an urgent tone inside, when you're in a conversation with somebody and there's an urgency to do a certain thing. So this is where the awareness is there, but you want to start detecting it earlier and earlier so that you have more time naturally to intervene in it. So what happens sometimes with this early detection is you might start to have a tension developing, but you're not fully aware of it. And some additional things happen, and then it becomes kind of this urgent thing. And the further you go down that line, the more likely it is that you're going to stumble into an automatic response, as opposed to, maybe there's a person at work that you get into conflict with quite a bit. And they say something a little off and it irritates you, but you don't do anything about it. You don't check yourself in your mind. You just kind of let it go. And then another thing happens, and then another thing happens. And then before you know it, you're in a full-blown argument because you've let those little things build up. So if you can detect it earlier and say, okay, here we go again. Now you have a chance to do something before you default to your automatic response.
Well, because you and I've talked about this a lot of times in the past. And look, I was somebody who kind of avoided these things. I would notice that they were there.
Yeah.
I would notice the signs, but for some reason I wouldn't act on them. And I would allow these things to build up. And then you know what happens next, man. It's like you pile on, pile on, pile on, pile on, and then the next thing you know, you've got the eruption. And
That's right.
and because it's not actually about the one thing. It's like when couples get into fights, and it's like the fight isn't about the fight that you're having right now. It's about all the fights that were leading up to it.
Right.
And so speak to that just a little bit, because I think that's a truth for so many people, is that we get the signal, but we don't act on it right away.
Right. Well, and sometimes you don't know what to do when things are at the lower phases,
Okay.
if that's kind of a script from earlier on that you learned growing up, that if you start complaining about things, or you start bringing things up as a legitimate topic, you're labeled as a complainer, and if your voice doesn't matter, then you kind of let it go until it erupts, and then when you're angry and erupting angrily, there's power in that. Now, it can be a destructive power and it can harm relationships, but there's a power in that. You want to get things to a point where you're able to be assertive, you're able to set appropriate boundaries, but you don't want to crush the people that are around you. You want to preserve those relationships while at the same time preserving those boundaries. So I think that's what balance looks like here.
Interesting. And I'm just thinking about this again, to go back into, there's two areas that we can tackle: relationships, personal relationships, or career-minded individuals and business relationships. Which feels like a good place to go first?
Well, I think what we're talking about here really applies well in both.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what does it look like in personal relationships? What does it look like in career-minded individuals and business relationships?
Well, I think it might be helpful to go through some of the other things, because it's not
Okay.
just about the early detection part. There's other aspects to this that I
Let's
think
go.
are
I'm all
important.
in. I'm all in. And hopefully people are playing along at home and getting a lot out of this. I
Yeah.
know each and every week I am, because if there's been a podcast that I've talked about to more and more people, it's been this metacognition piece. So let's go.
And you'll see that these other areas as well, I think they translate equally well into business interactions and in personal relationships.
Okay.
So the
Rip it
next
up,
one
man.
is flexibility in your responses. So you're not just automatically responding. You have a pause, and you have choices now in the situation, as awareness is growing and as control is growing. So what does that look like? Maybe you pause and do nothing. Maybe after you pause, you still proceed and allow the fast thinking process to go forward. And then, in other words, that your impulse was correct and it's okay to allow it to go. Maybe you need to reframe the situation and look at it differently. You got set off by something, but once you paused, you realize, oh, they're having a bad day, so it's not about me. I don't need to respond in a hostile way and make the situation worse, right? But maybe you wouldn't have caught that had you not paused in that moment. Sometimes pausing can lead to analysis. So I don't want to do anything right now immediately with this. I need to step back, engage slow thinking, and think this through a little bit, at least for a couple minutes before I fashion a response to it. So the key is not choosing the right move every time, but just being aware that there's more than one way to go at it, and that pause that metacognition gives you opens up the possibility for additional options. There's flexibility there.
I want to make sure I've got this. So we can be flexible in our response. We can reframe, or we can take a minute and analyze what needs to happen next. Those are the three you've mentioned so far.
Yep. Pause and do nothing. Proceed with fast thinking. Reframe the situation, or stop, analyze, and engage slow thinking. So there's actually four.
Right. Pause and do nothing. Got it. Okay.
So the next one is proportionality. If you catch the process early, and you insert a pause, it gives you the option of responding in a proportional way.
What does that mean?
In other words, something small stays small. You're not making a mountain out of a molehill situation. So somebody irritates you mildly, and you're not blowing up and nuking them, in a meeting or embarrassing them publicly. That you're irritated, and your response is proportioned to what it is. The other thing is you can tolerate ambiguity longer with this pause. So if you're not sure what it is that you're looking at, instead of jumping into a quick conclusion, that pause can give you the ability to kind of sit with the uncertainty of, gee, I'm not really sure what's going on here. Let me not overreact to the situation until I get more information. Disagreements don't automatically escalate, right? So if you're talking with somebody and you're not seeing eye to eye, it doesn't need to immediately turn into a fight. You can sit with that disagreement and maybe work toward a solution with it. So those are some of the things where, like I said, proportionality is the other piece of it that can come out of this.
All right, a couple of questions that I want to ask.
Yep.
When you say tolerate ambiguity, what do you mean by that?
So somebody says something to you and it strikes you a little weird. It's like, why would he ask me that? So you don't really know. Now, in that moment, you can jump to a conclusion and say, this guy's been pushing my buttons every day this week. That MF, I'm gonna just light him up now. You don't know what his motivation is. You don't know why he asked you that question, right? So that's the ambiguity part. You're irritated by it, that's for sure, but the why isn't there. And instead of filling in the blank with your own interpretation of what it means, you're going to put your detective hat on and try to find out some more information first. So maybe that might be asking the person a question like, hey, you asked me this thing earlier today, and I'm not sure if I understand where you were going with that. Can you explain that to me? So now you're giving them an opportunity to give you a better response instead of just assuming that they're being a jerk and that you're going to light them up for it.
This is good, and it kind of ties back to the talk I was giving this weekend about how to talk to people you don't like talking to in cases, because the title of that speech is meant to be a little bit provocative, but what I mean by that is we all have moments where somebody asks us something and it hits us a certain way, it makes us feel a certain way, and then like in that moment it becomes somebody that you don't really want to be talking to. And, and it can happen really quickly. And so I love your example of, hey, can I ask you? Because if you remember from Saturday, one of the first things that I teach people is tone. And I believe that a curious tone is probably one of the best ways to approach any kind of conflict. And so I love the setup there, right? Hey.
And you're responding to somebody else's tone too.
Right.
So maybe somebody who's not dialed in doesn't have a good control of their tone, and they're coming off in a way that's abrasive, but maybe they're not intending to be abrasive. Maybe there's something going on there that's different than what you're thinking.
You know what I'm wondering though is I've met these kind of people before where, let's say you're having a bad day and you're a little irritated and you snapped at a coworker or your spouse, and you didn't mean to, but you just kind of had a lot on your mind and you were a little bit short with them. And then immediately what they do is they match your energy. And so they get snippy right back at you. I think what I'm gathering from our conversation today is this is where metacognition is beneficial, because you're able to put that pause in there and say, hold on a second. Maybe this isn't geared like specifically towards me. Maybe this has everything to do with them. And then to use your words, I can reframe this. I can tolerate ambiguity. I can make sure that small things stay small, and I don't have to be the one that makes them big. It feels like that's the application of what we're talking about.
Right. And it also can go the other way too. I can think of situations when I was in hospital administration. I had an amazing secretary back in the day, and she would set me up for meetings and have everything organized and laid out. And I really respected her as a resource for me, and I didn't want any tension that I'm feeling to like spill over onto her and interfere with her ability to do good work. So if I came out of a really bad meeting and I'm just steaming, I'm pissed, I'll go in and I'll say, look, I'm really in a bad mood right now. Has nothing to do with you. I just got out of a meeting. Somebody just really set me off. I need a few minutes to regroup. Please don't take it personally. It's not about you. I'm just going to lock my door for a while and please just divert any calls until I come out, right? So what that does is it gives the other person context so that they're not misinterpreting your sour mood, right? So if you have good relationships with people, you can improve on those, and then they also develop the ability to read you. So in the event that you didn't give them the heads up when things are not going well, they can kind of say, okay, the last time he said that, he probably just got out of a bad meeting. And then you don't end up with these unintended escalations between people that you care about and need to work well with. You
That's
kind of
so
keep them
good.
in the loop. Yeah.
It's so good. And I just encourage it, man. If there's like one takeaway, it's that for me, for people. It's like understand that almost everything has nothing to do with you. Like almost everything.
Mhm.
And this idea of stop taking it so personally.
Mhm.
Sometimes you're just in the line of fire, and that's called life. And the ability to like pause and go, all right, that wasn't directed at me. And I want to encourage people too, and I want your take on this. And we need to wrap up here the next couple of minutes too. But what we're doing here is just accepting that people are going to have human behavior, right?
Mhm.
Like, okay, Dave's having a bad day. Dave had a bad meeting. And what I like about your example is not just for the woman that you worked with, because now she can feel some empathy towards you. She can
That's
feel
right.
some compassion towards you.
Mhm.
And where if you just came and snapped at her, her tendency might be, I'm going to get him back. I'm going to patch that phone call through for that person that he doesn't really want to be
Yeah.
talking to right now.
Or worse yet, they go quiet and they stew on it. So
Right.
now you have this level of resentment that's building, and you have no idea what you've just unleashed.
Masterclass on how to interact with people today, Dave. Thank you very much. Is there one final thought you'd like to wrap with?
Can I do 3 more final thoughts?
Okay, make them quick because we're coming up on 21 minutes now. I really want
Okay.
to respect our time.
So the fourth one is efficient use of slow thinking. So there are times when you want to shift from fast thinking to slow thinking, and that pause can give you the ability to say, look, instead of just immediately reacting to the situation, let me pause and analyze it a little bit further before I react. And kind of touched on that a little bit with the previous one.
Mhm.
The next one is a faster recovery. So you can expect that as you're building in quadrant 4 and that you're developing more control, you also recover quicker when you do get set off. So you can be pulled into a reactive situation, you notice it sooner, you de-escalate it sooner, and then repairs can take place more quickly to get back on an equal footing again. Again, the system's not perfect, but at least it becomes self-correcting. And then the final one is you have access to emotions without feeling driven by them. Um, so a lot of times when awareness is low and control is still low, emotional triggers immediately set you into motion and determine the outcome based on old scripts. When you develop metacognition, you have the awareness and you have some measure of control, you can feel those emotions without being obligated to do a specific course of action based on how you're feeling emotionally. So you can feel anger without immediately lashing out. You can feel anxiety without immediately shutting down and avoiding the situation. You can feel some level of sadness without completely coming unglued and collapsing. And the emotion kind of informs the decision that you make, but is not driving it blindly.
It's a really interesting concept.
Mm.
Access to the emotions without being driven by them. So you're
Yep.
not saying don't feel it. You're saying don't feel it and make that the driver of how you behave next.
Right. Or just because you feel X doesn't mean you need to do Y. If you feel angry, it doesn't mean that you have to lash out. So a lot of times these are old scripts. These are things that developed in childhood, that when you feel a certain way, the response is scripted because of previous relationships. You don't have to go down that road just because you feel that particular emotion.
So good.
That's where the control comes in. You have more options available.
I almost feel like next week we could go over this a little bit more too. It would be wise of us to do it, because there is a lot to efficient use of slow thinking, faster recovery, and access to emotions. Well, Dave, thanks again, man, for just putting this all together for us. I know that the people are listening to this are gaining things from this,
Yeah.
and hopefully, I think the goal is, where are you in this equation? Like, are you living in 1, 2, 3? Have you evolved to number 4? I think a big part of me would like to think that I live mostly in quadrant 4, but
Yeah.
I slip up sometimes. And then I think,
Right.
maybe we end with your take on this, which is, don't beat yourself up when you slip up.
Well, yeah, blind spots are still going to be there. Your capacity to do this is going to be limited, and if you're under stress, or you haven't slept well last night, or if there's a bunch of time constraints coming down, this system's not going to work perfectly for you. You're going to tend to regress under stress. So you have to give yourself a measure of grace as you're doing this, and realize that it's a learning and growing process, and that there are still things that can short circuit it in the moment. Some people even still have biases that they're not aware of, and it takes time to root all that stuff out. But what you're doing is you're committing to a process of self-improvement and growth. And the more you look at it, just like what they say in business, the thing that you measure, you get more of. If you want to improve in this area, the more you're looking at it, the more you're taking the time, not in the situation, to look at it, and then trying to road test it in the situation, you'll get better at it.
Love it. If you guys want to read more about what Dave writes about, the QR code in the top right will take you right to his Substack account, and you can have a look at what he's writing. And then next week, we're going to have a pretty interesting conversation. We may need to just touch on this stuff again, if it makes sense, but we're going to be talking about the idea of paralyzation by information, like when you feel the need to learn too much and don't act on it. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. Dave, thanks as always, man. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Take care, everybody.